to the ADNA Presents. This is Roy Samuelson. Today, we're very happy to have Alison Eardley joining us. She helps museums make sure everyone, whether they can see or not, enjoy and understand what's on display. She studies how our senses work and teaches museums how to design experiences that include everybody. She works with lots of different people to create descriptions and stories that make museum visits more fun and fair. I'm really excited to talk to Alison. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Roy. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
When you think about audio description, what inspired you to think about it in a different way and how you approached it?
Audio description was traditionally created to make a visual image accessible to somebody who's blind or partially blind. But what it actually does is it provides a kind of journey or a pathway through an object or an item or something in a museum, a story or a narrative. And that pathway, it creates a story. The best audio descriptions for me are the ones that create a story, not ones that tell you what to think or dictate the way things are presented, but ones which guide your attention through something. Now, if you've got access to vision, that can be guiding your visual attention. If you don't have access to vision, it's still trying to build a story in your mind. And I would actively say not trying to build an image in your mind. Some people want to have an image built in their mind, but a lot of people don't. But actually what we do want is to build a story and a narrative and a journey. And that's what got me started, was how we could build that story, that experience for everybody, basically.
What an exciting attitude towards audio description. That when I think about that attention, I think about focus, of where I'm headed. And focus is such a visual word. Thinking about how glasses can support low vision to put something in focus. There's so many angles to jump on. You started with story. You said story a few times. Why is story so important to you?
To me, because stories help us create memories. Basically, if we want to remember something, we want something that's gonna capture us, that's gonna engage us. And I don't mean stories in the fictional sense. I don't mean stories in that kind of made up or basically in that made up sense. That it's a way of creating a journey for us. It creates a sort of a journey which we can find our own ways of engaging with, something that we can catch onto and latch onto and that can inspire us. And sometimes it might be we listen and we don't agree. So it doesn't have to be something that speaks to our truth. It just needs to be something we can engage with and we can question and we can agree with or disagree depending.
Could you give a specific example of something in your work with WICAD, that is emblematic of this journey of story? Maybe something that you could give our audience a sense. We mainly focus in this podcast about film and TV, but we're taking it to a different direction and context in this interview. And I think there's a lot of similarities. Is there anything that comes to mind that you could share? For example, something that would traditionally be done this way, but the way that you've approached it with your organization, it focuses on this story in the context that you're sharing.
Actually, yes, there's an example that I really enjoyed. Actually, part of a project called the Sensational Museum. We did some work where we were looking to create museum exhibits where no one sense was necessary or sufficient. That was the kind of grounding principle. And it was underpinned by a lot of the similar thinking as Wicked. I couldn't work out why people were pronouncing it Wicked, because I was like, why are you saying Wicked? It's wicked. And then I realized actually it's because that's exactly what it says. But anyway, so basically, anyway, within the Sensational Museum project, we were working with a group in Keswick. It's a museum. Little exhibits that they created were co-created with pan-disabled groups. And so they created this exhibit. And when we came to do the audio description of that exhibit, it was really fascinating because it didn't exist yet. It wasn't actually built. So we had to do the audio description before. It wasn't an add-on. It was part of the process. And what was so amazing was that what they designed was a sort of, at some levels, you could consider it a reasonably traditional exhibit in a museum. It represented a sort of mountainscape, and they had, what was not so usual was that they had a patch of moss, real live living moss within their exhibit. And what they were trying to communicate was the journey of, and I might not have the historic details correct here, so I apologize to my co-creators in Keswick and Keswick Museum. But basically, it was the journey, I think, of copper ore from the mountains in the Lake District, where the museum was based, and it'd been a local craft. So it was about the journey of that copper ore, the people who used to mine that copper ore, the cottage industries where they basically created this metalwork, basically, and they had plates. And so they followed that through. And one of the things, the reason why they had a square patch of moss in this exhibit was because they wanted to tell the story of the mountains and the journey of people being up there, the feelings of walking in that environment, basically being in that environment. And so when they came to describe the audio description of the exhibit, they didn't describe, you're going to now feel a square patch of moss and it's going to feel like this. What they did was they situated the feeling of that moss in the mountains. So they talked about squelching through the water. They talked about the feeling of the moisture and the wetness. They talked about the actual feeling of the moss, which does have a more kind of spidery feel to it rather than something that's smooth and velvet textured. But because they situated in something much bigger, it took out this slightly uninteresting, what could have been an uninteresting description of just that thing that was there itself. And it just brought it to life in a story. And it enriched, to me, so much the experience of the exhibit, basically.
I'd love to go back to you saying that this was created with pan-disabled groups, that they were part of the process. It seems obvious that is such an integral part of the success of this. Was there any resistance or was there any concerns about including disabled people from the beginning? And this is a softball question.
I think, the thing that's really interesting for me is that one of the challenges when you talk to people about pan-disabled groups is they find it hard imagining it outside the world of access. As soon as you start talking pan-disabled, they assume that the main audience is the disability group. So for audio description, blind and partially blind, well, blind and partially blind people are creating it for blind and partially blind people. And so I don't think that that's not completely true. Sometimes there's a resistance where people really don't understand. So how can somebody who's blind or partially blind describe something? Because there's so much often that assumption that people have no vision at all. And I would just on a terminology, I would say that we use partially blind instead of low vision because it comes from a standpoint of not being defined by a lack. Low vision doesn't really do that in the way that visually impaired would do. So low vision is a much more common term in the US actually than it is in the UK. But that's why we use blind and partially blind. Just wanted to explain that. But yeah, so basically sometimes I think people find it hard to imagine if you're working with people with a disability, how that then relates to everybody else, because they find it really hard to break out of this notion that everybody who is sighted and able and neurotypical can't just walk into a museum as an example and get all of it automatically immediately, and they can't. But I think that's the only real barrier we've had, possibly because the people we've been working with have already been bought into it. Do you know what I mean? I think there will be a lot of people out there who would say, how can somebody who's blind or partially blind describe? Or how does that work? What does that mean? Because it is absolutely led by the blind and partially blind co-creators and not led by the sighted person. Although it's still an interaction, but it's not led by the sighted person. Doesn't privilege vision, basically.
That leadership makes such a difference. When you think about the exhibit and how it was led by pan-disabled groups and that the assumptions were removed that sighted people usually bring to it, do you see some parallels for audio description, film, and television?
It's a really good question, and it's something I've thought about. And I know some of my colleagues would say you absolutely can use audio description for everyone. And I think that things like subtitles, as an example, people more and more use subtitles, even though in theory those are created for people who might be in the deaf community. But but I think it can, because it does provide an attention. Sometimes it's built into things. So you think about like nature programs as an example. And if in nature programs, you could build in some incredible description to what people are saying and how people are narrating a nature program, which would really enrich the experience for everyone. It could draw attention to those details. It could draw attention to those kind of narratives, and it could be just built into the program. How it would work across all programs, I'm not so sure. I think that's a question I'd love to get your thoughts on. but yeah, I do think that there's scope for adding in much more kind of inclusive description for all of us, because we just overestimate what we can do with our eyes alone, basically.
It's such a great approach. And this holistic approach seems to come up so much when we think about the idea of sensory inequity. It's such a big idea. When you think about how that's being addressed from the very beginning, what would you share with our audience that they might appreciate in that context?
I am an academic and I can't help myself, but I tend to start with Aristotle, so dead white Greek philosopher from 2000 odd years ago. And the fact that our societies, particularly in Europe and North America, are really fundamentally based on the thoughts of someone from 2000 years ago, which we now know are false. And it's so inbuilt into our accepted truths. One of the accepted truths is if we have five senses, which is not true. We have 3, 9, 27. There's all different ways of counting, but five doesn't exist as one of those numbers. And the other one is this prioritization of vision. And, honestly, we've also tried to create societies where there's one way of doing things which fits, we assume, the majority. But actually, when we think about it, that majority it really fits is actually a tiny minority. When we think about, because sometimes access has come from good intentions, it's absolutely come from really positive intentions, which is making sure that people who couldn't get access something are given access. But I think my challenge for me, the thing I struggle with, is we still assume what we're doing at the core of our design and our function and our ways of communicating works, and so then access actually ends up othering people around the outside, because anybody who's not in that center is othered automatically. Inclusion does the same thing, but if we think about the people we are excluding and who can't access, that's more people than who are included. And just let's flip this upside down. Let's turn it around. Let's actually build our societies based on everything we do around the outside, because it's going to enhance the experience of everybody we think we're already meeting the needs of, basically.
What a beautiful answer. And that ties into your background, your experience in such a reflective way. Thank you for sharing that. I'm thinking about so many things that we've covered already in this interview. Is there something that we haven't shared yet that's important for our audience to know that we haven't talked about yet?
It's a really good question. I have to say, I think one of the things I would say, and this is just from a museum perspective, although perhaps you could do it with maybe not film, certainly not in a cinema, because it would annoy people, but with TV. But with museums, it's based on, the Wicked model is based on informal communication, conversation, and it's based on the organic development of a conversation. And most people go to a museum and they don't know what to look at and they don't really understand where to start. And what we found from our kind of co-creation sessions was that our co-creators, so we did this in order to produce, actually, honestly, to produce kind of digital interpretation. But the people who were part of the co-creation session absolutely loved it. They were like, so many of them were like, oh my goodness, that has transformed the way I think about museums. That was so much fun. I just got so many different levels of engaging. I didn't know I would think those things. So I would basically suggest, if you don't think you like museums, or even if you do think you like museums, take a couple of friends. If you have friends who are different neurotypes to you or different kind of abilities to you, or go to a museum, sit there, find something and try and describe it with each other. It's so much fun, basically. I love listening to them, so I'd love to hear the conversations, but it is so much fun.
I love that answer. Yes. And going back to our very beginning again, you literally said where to start, and the journey has to start somewhere. And it just keeps bringing it back to story, that informal, organic conversation that happens in that museum experience is part of the story, and it provides that attention. This ties in so perfectly.
I did actually just think of one more thing. One of the things we have struggled with slightly is the question of objectivity and subjectivity. And the question as to, often we've thought that what we're trying to do for somebody who's blind or partially blind is give them a neutral, objective, neutral kind of, people pretend that neutral is objective or is not anyway, but neutral objective description. And it often comes down to people don't want to be told, they don't want you to tell them what to think. And I am 100% in agreement with the fact that you don't tell people what to think. I tend to try to nudge museums away from their slightly traditional factual descriptions. But the reality is that our perceptual experiences are all subjective. I think I see the same thing as the person who's standing next to me. I can't imagine that their colours and their shapes, their forms, surely this is concrete, factual information that we see the same, we experience the same, we hear the same. We don't. It's all subjective. And if we acknowledge that subjectivity and we acknowledge, we not only acknowledge it, but we embrace it, and we think about what we want when we're in a museum, we want or in front of a TV or a film, we want an experience. We don't want factual communication. We want our emotions to be engaged. We want our memories to be engaged. We want everything about ourselves. We want to find something in there that means something to us. And honestly, I think that the most honest and best way of doing it is by suggesting things, by suggesting your own ideas, things you think, your own experiences, bringing that, not telling them, they won't experience it the same way as you. But if you're sharing your experience, then people can find what they agree or disagree with in that of their own experience.
Isn't that bringing back the agency, whether it's the audience or the patron to the museum, that they have the choice?
Yes, 100%. I love that. Yes.
How can we follow you on social media, your website, anything that you feel comfortable sharing publicly?
I am on LinkedIn, which is, I know, a bit of a kind of business starting point. It's a bit of a work thing, but I'm on LinkedIn. Websites, we've got the Wicked website is there. We try to put up different kind of news items on there. There is a free, the Wicked training is available online for free. So anybody who's interested, whether you want to become, you are an audio describer, you are somebody who listens to audio description, it is hopefully accessible to everybody. That's there. And I'm slowly, and not as frequently as I was like, trying to fitting it around other academic duties, looking to set up a facilitator network on that as well, so that people can talk to each other and communicate and share ideas. I'm on Blue Skies. I'm not on X anymore, or I am, but I don't use it. But yeah, and actually, honestly, I'm happy to be emailed as well. There's chat boards on the website, on the course as well. So that also gives an opportunity to connect with other people through that and have discussions on there as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us, Allison.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.